Welcome to the NEREJ NYREJ podcast. I'm your host, Rick Kaplan. I have a special guest today, Joseph Aquino, and he is the president of JAACRES. Good morning, Joe. We'll call you Joe.
Hi, yes, please call me Joe. Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing great. So, Joe, you have a very interesting story, and you also wrote a book. But tell me the journey that you've had since you began in the commercial real estate industry.
Sure. So just to recap, it's I'm celebrating 40 years in commercial real estate in Manhattan, and it's a tough group here. The landlords take the word "lord" very serious, and I still have my sense of humor. I still love what I do. But what was interesting is my first 10 years, I started out really from the streets of Brooklyn, New York. I mean, everyone loves Brooklyn now. Brooklyn at some point had a bit of a hard rap, but now everyone's realizing how wonderful Brooklyn is. But I always knew how wonderful Brooklyn was. But we started out from the streets of Brooklyn, and we ended up into the boardrooms of Manhattan, where I was working with such clients as Cartier and Buccellati, and working on the 42nd Street development project in Times Square, where we turned it around. So where the journey started, it really started on a street corner in Brooklyn, where I was selling knife sets, and it was around Mother's Day, and there was a junkie that was sizing me up on my table, and I knew that he wanted the cash in my hand, so I right away I grabbed the one of the bigger knives, and out of nowhere, two men came out of a car and they started talking to me as they were my long lost friends. And when the junkie went away, I thanked them. But sure enough, they had a bit of agenda. They said, no, we've been watching you. You're a great salesman, and we actually do this peddling on a grander scale in Manhattan. And right away, back then, there was these Kismet schemes where they would want you to invest 10, 20, or 30,000 to buy product, and then you were just left with the product. You were never able to sell it. So I told these gentlemen right away, look, I don't have any money. No, we don't want any money. We want you. And sure enough, they wanted me to come the next day to see the operation. It was a Friday. I wanted to come on Monday. And Peter insisted, no, you have to come tomorrow. So sure enough, I came the next day, and they were running this operation out of a storefront in the Fur District. And as soon as I walked in, there was like 30 people, handling product and glass sets and pot sets, and they were putting stuff on a van with carts. And I looked, and immediately I said, you know what? I like the vibe here. I can do this. So sure enough, they started putting me on a street corner with glass sets, pot sets, crock pot sets, knife sets from England, Sheffield knife sets, and I would sell out in like an hour, 2 hours, and most people wouldn't sell out the entire day. In fact, the first time the driver dropped me off on the corner, we would always go across the street from Macy's or Mays. He said, "Look, normally the first thing that people touch is normally what they buy." So, when I would deal with 6 or 7 people at one time, I'd always see what people were touching, and it always stayed in my memory. Well, sure enough, one day I got bronchitis and I had to stay home. And unbeknownst to me, Peter, one of the principals, was handing out false IDs to the guys that couldn't sell. They were out there for 8 hours. If you were out there for 8 hours, you would eventually got a ticket by the police department. Was the only place you were allowed to market your goods back then was on 12th Avenue to the Fish. So sure enough, Ronnie said, "Oh, Joey must have rat us out," and Peter said, "No, Joey didn't know we were doing this. Joey's innocent." So Peter was a former encyclopedia salesman, and unbeknownst to me, he was also a former heroin addict that was now on methadone. So the police put Ronnie and Peter in jail for the evening. And basically Peter ran up the walls. He didn't have his medicine, and the next day he came out. He says, "That's it. I'm finished peddling. I never want to go into jail again. He said, Joey, stay home. I'm going to go find a product we can sell door to door. So I stayed home for 2 weeks. It was around the summertime. I was going to the beach every day. And finally, I got a call. And he said, all right, come on in. I found something. I said, all right. I didn't even ask questions. So sure enough, I see Peter the next morning, and he hands me a box. And it's a watch box with a white sleeve on it. And I open it up, and I open it, and it's a skin diver's watch. It's got three dials. One dial gave you there was cities all around the world. And if you set the timer on New York City, you can tell the time in Zurich and in London and in Rome and in Shanghai. Now, this is 1976. Nobody was traveling back then, but it was so unique. I mean, you can find out, what the time was in Moscow, okay? So, it was kind of gimmicky, and it was the skin diver's watch, and then, it also had a skin diver's dial, and the middle one was the calendar and date. He's all right, come on. He says, I've been out for a couple of days. He says they're really easy to sell. He says, follow me. So Peter went out for 2 hours, and the way Peter was selling, it was like giving candy to a baby. Everyone bought from Peter. So Peter said, all right, look, come in tomorrow and we're going to send you out. We'll send you out. We'll see how you do. So the next day I came, and sure enough, I mean, I didn't have Peter's presentation, but out of 10 watches, I sold eight. And had the cash in my hand, and I came back, and Peter smiled. He said, I knew you had it in you. Was not every peddler was able to convert into door-to-door sales. So I did that for 2 years. I walked into every retail store in the five boroughs and also decent neighborhoods in Long Island. Now, we weren't selling wholesale. We were selling the watch either for personal use or someone can buy it as a gift. Okay. So I got burnt out. I mean, I couldn't do it anymore. But a lot of people were offering me jobs. So I would say, gee, let me think, who offered me work back then? And I remember that the health club people like Jack LaLanne's, they'd always say, hey, like, you're great. You should work for us. So sure enough, I go to the location across the street from King's Plaza in Brooklyn. And they said, sure, go see Eileen Collins at the Biltmore Hotel in Manhattan. And a few days later, I'm sitting in front of a former Miss USA. I mean, she was gorgeous. I think she was a runner-up. She didn't win, but she was the picture of health, Eileen Collins. And I got the job, and I went into training, and unbeknownst to me, they didn't call it a management training program back then, but that's basically what it was. So for 8 years, I when I became manager, which took a couple of years, you'd work 10 to 10 Monday through Friday, and that was a unique situation. 10 to 10, those were mandated hours. Back then, they only had one manager per location, where if the location did poorly, they would blame that one manager. And initially, back then in 1978, 79, nobody worked out. I mean, it just wasn't a lifestyle. People were smoking, they were eating whatever they wanted. Nobody jogged. Hardly anybody lift weights, because when you lift weights, that meant you were a muscle head. I mean, women never lifted weights. They always had questions. So when people came in, you literally had to do a presentation for at least an hour, and they would give you an interview sheet where the first 6 months you explain to Mrs. Jones, we have to tighten the muscles and reduce the fat. And then, yeah, but Mrs. Jones, after the 6 months, if you stop, you're just going to go back to where you are. The second 6 months is a maintenance program. So right away, you shift them into a 1 year program. And then you would talk about excuses and procrastination and make funny stories. And you say, look, I'm sure you don't know anybody like that. And they'd always giggle. No, 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 no. I do that all the time. I always say I'm going to exercise, but it never happens. And then at the end, you had to slip in the card and say, all right, Mrs. Jones, here's the card. fill out the card, get yourself started. And back then, my father died at when I was 13 of a heart attack, and my mother died when I was 21 of a heart attack. So I had absolutely no guilt of pushing anybody into a health program. I believed back then everybody should stop salt, everybody should eat healthy, everybody should work out, and everybody should do cardio. And then during this period, this was the go-go years, the 80s of the health club. Our organization, we were the first ones to do aerobic classes. I mean, we always had calisthenic classes, and then we do circuit training where you had 12 machines in a line, and then there used to be this recording every 20 seconds. It would say stop, rotate, and you would get up and you would go on to the next machine. So there was a whole line of people going down this assembly line. But meanwhile, everybody was working every muscle in their body, and they were getting themselves in shape. So basically, in order to be the manager of like Jack Lane, you had to be like a full brush salesman where you had to sell everybody to come in. But you also had to be Ray Kroc at McDonald's where you had to manage the place. You had to make sure the place was clean. You had to make sure that the instructors were servicing, not just the pretty girls, the men, especially the lifeguards. We used to have a lot of seniors in the water. I used to have presentations with the staff every month just to remind them what their job description was. And I used to explain to them the things I promised in this hour presentation, and why we were charging like $700 back then, which was a lot of money, but we used to give people a payment plan. So that was quite exciting. But then when I was 29, I was honest with myself. I said, can I work 10 to 10 Monday through Friday when I'm 50? Can I be coming home at 11:30 at night? At that point, I wasn't married, nor did I have a serious relationship. The only people you would date are, either the staff or members. So I decided, I says, look, I gotta find a different career. So my parents already passed away. So altruistically, my mother did this thing to my father, like in the early 50s. Daddy was a longshoreman. So he comes home one afternoon, the month of August, there's no air conditioning, to a seven-course turkey dinner. So my father's eating and he's smiling. And then he finally goes, all right, he goes, my mother's name was Ann. He goes, all right, Annie, what did you buy? So, he figuring that she bought a dress or a radio. So she said, Daddy, she says, I bought a three-family house. And he spit the food out. He said, we can't afford that. I'm a longshoreman. And she said, sure we can. And she sat him down and she showed him how if we rent upstairs and downstairs, how we can live on the first level and live rent free. So, you know, at one point, my parents owned three houses, but by the time, I'm like 29, those were long sold. So altruistically, I said, oh, maybe I should be going into the family business. So there was a member, her name was Judith Gray, that lived in Sutton Place in Manhattan, which is a very exclusive area. And she was married to this announcer, Joel Gray, radio announcer. So we went out to dinner, and she introduced me to Gail Coverdale, and Gail explained to me all the different sectors of real estate. There's residential, there's office leasing, there's investment sales where you deal with the property owners, and there's industrial. And I said, no, I think I want to do investment sales. So she introduced me to this company, Siegel Shore Associates, and sure enough, I got the job, and I went back to Jack Lane's, and I told them, the news, and they were, we were all like family back then, and like, look, we hate to see you go, and then I got a call a couple of days later. They said, look, can we give you at least a letter of reference? At first, I said no. Then the next day, I said, you never know when I'm going to need this. So I called them back, and they sent me this beautiful letter, stating that, maybe my parting was, maybe it's temporary. Maybe I'll come back to a position equal or to one above. And I still have that letter to today. And I started my journey. I started in investment sales. So I was with this company, and they had to do a bit of training because it was all about the return on investment and on development. There's another expression, FAR, floor area ratio, where if you have a plot of land that's 10,000 square feet and your FAR is 10, that means you can build 100,000 square feet. Okay. So I had to, go through the quick course of learning. But sure enough, in 2 years, I sold three apartment buildings in Harlem to three different investors. Was That's when Harlem started getting hot back then. That was about 1989. And each apartment building was 24 units. I sold land in Long Beach, Long Island, which is totally on the other side of the universe. You have Harlem and Long Island, a quarter acre of land, which they built 18 townhouses they built on that. I was involved in a 200,000 square foot industrial property with two other brokers in Maspeth, Queens. At one point, that was a large industrial area. And then out of nowhere, I sold a 90,000 square foot shopping center in Salem, Massachusetts to Michael J. Harrington. I think he was the former congressman of Massachusetts. We have to do a fact check on that. And the sellers were Butcher and Singer, one of the oldest investment bankers in Philadelphia. And how I did that deal is I was working that property and I said to Jim Stanton at Butcher and Stinger, I said, look, there must be somebody at one point that really was interested, but you couldn't do the deal. He says, yeah, it's this guy, Michael Harrington. I says, Jim, why don't you give me a shot? Maybe this needs to be brokered. He's all right. I'll let you work with Michael. So I get Michael interested, and I have a meeting now that we're all going to go to Salem, Massachusetts, to meet with Michael Harrington to talk about the deal. And I drive 5 hours from Brooklyn. They fly in from Philadelphia, and then Michael, like 10 minutes before the meeting, says, "I don't want to meet them." I said, Michael, are you serious? So I tell this to Jim Stanton, and like he's, really upset, but he's a gentleman. He walks away. I go into back to Michael's office. Michael, are you crazy? You just don't do this to people. No, no, no. No reason to meet. So the next day, I call up Jim. I said, Jim, who's the biggest landlord in Massachusetts, in Boston? He goes, Harold Brown. I said, I'll call you right back. So I call up Michael J. Harrington. I said, who's Michael? Who's Harold Brown? He says, what? Why? Why? I said, was they got Harold Brown that wants to buy this? He goes, Harold Brown. He goes, Harold Brown doesn't have to get financing. All he has to do is write a check. He goes, I'll call you back in 30 minutes. And 30 minutes later, he calls me back. He says, all right, we're going to give $3 million is the purchase price. We're going to give $100,000 down, and we're going to close in 90 days. So I call up Jim Stanton. I tell him the story. We both had a good laugh. Jim accepted the offer, and 90 days later, we did the deal. So, so what happened was, in around 1989, there was tax reform, and that changed the pricing and the structure on how to do deals on when you buy properties. So before tax reform, if you were a doctor and you were making $2 million a year of personal income, and if you had properties that were, say, were losing $2 million, you were able to take your earned income and apply it to the losses you had in real estate. And basically, at that year, you would pay no income tax, and people's properties were skyrocketing. The market was out of whack, and but basically the doctors would eventually earn appreciation. In 5 years, 10 years, the property would be worth 50% more or 100% more. Well, overnight, the government said we can't do that anymore. You know, only real estate professionals can do that. So overnight, properties dropped about 40%. And when you're a real estate broker and properties drop 40%, you just nothing gets traded. So all of a sudden, I'm in a slack market. A slack market is like a slack tide. When you're fishing, if the tide isn't going in or out, and if you're standing still, if the tide's standing still, you never catch fish. So now I'm in a slack market where nothing is moving. So I had to pivot. So what I eventually did is at 31, I went for this job to actually be the canvasser at Garrett Gord's store leasing. And normally a canvasser, they normally come out of college, they're 21, 22, and it's very basic. You're just canvassing properties for the entire firm. You're not working on a commission basis. They give you a pittance of a salary. Back then it was $250. But that worked for me. My rent back then was $600. I was living in a basement 1 block from the water in Manhattan Beach. So I wanted that job. So when I called for the job on a Wednesday, Lee Stan, who unfortunately just passed away 2 weeks ago, he's 93 now. He said, "It's Wednesday. We put the ad in on Sunday. We hired some kid out of college on Monday." I said, "Mr. Stan, you really want to meet me?" I said, I just sold a shopping center in Salem, Massachusetts. I said, and so now Mr. Stan's thinking, like, let me get this guy in. I'll convert him back to selling properties. And I'm saying, no, I want to get in there and I want to get this salary position. And I knew that I knew nothing about leasing retail space. But if I was looking for properties for the next 6 months, at least I would know the inventory. And then if I found a restaurateur or if I found a retailer, at least I'd be able to bring them to the best property in the marketplace. So that was my strategy. So sure enough, I go into Friday to the meeting, and in the background is they're playing it. His radio on a very low volume is playing Rocky, Gonna Fly Now, and I saw that as a good sign because I would always watch Rocky 1, 2, 3, 4 for motivation, and so I'm showing him the picture. Back then, there was no digital cameras. I actually hired a professional photographer in Salem, Massachusetts. I paid him back then $700 to take a professional picture of the shopping center. And why I did that is like telling someone you sold the shopping center is one thing, but then showing them the picture is another thing. So he was really impressed. He says, "Look, I'll give you a job. I'll give you a desk on Monday. You can sell properties." And I had to be firm. I said, "Look, I don't want to do that." I said, "I think retail leasing is going to be great." I said, "First of all, I was a retailer for 8 years, working for Jacqueline." I said, "And for 3 years, I was selling properties with property owners. So I know both sides of the equation. I think I'm going to be perfect doing retail leasing." He said, "But we hired this kid out of college." I said, "Look, Mr. Stan," I said, "that kid can get a job anywhere." I said, "You want to hire me? I got experience." He goes, "All right." He said, I can't make that decision. I got to speak to the owner." He says, "But call me on Tuesday." So sure enough, back then, there was no mobile phones. I was I was in Manhattan. I went to one of those phone booths, filthy phone booths. I put the quarter in. I was pressing the numbers. Please stand, please. So he gets on the phone. I said, "Hi, it's Joe Aquino." "Yeah, yeah." I said, "We met Friday about the canvases job." "Right, right, right, right." He said, "Well," and he's playing me. "Well," I think he must have said, "Well," like four. "Well," every time he's saying "well," my heart's going out. I said, "Was at this point, investment sales was flat." "Well, we're going to give you a shot. We told the kid from college, go find himself another job." And I just screamed like, "Lee!" I said, "You're not going to be sorry. I'm going to make you proud of me." And sure enough, he says, "Can you start on Monday?" I said, "Yeah, I can start on Monday." So when I went in, I took the job very serious. I canvassed a couple of days. And like after a week, I was like, Jesus, I forgot like what blocks I went. So I got a Hankster map, made a copy, made it about 2 feet wide. And every time I did a block, I would highlight it and highlight it with yellow. This way I wouldn't go back to the same block. So, most canvases didn't do Manhattan one time, but I took the canvass's job like I was the CEO of canvassing. And in 6 months, I did, I canvassed Manhattan 3 times. So anyway, that's the first basically 10 years of the book. I mean, eventually now, we go into
Well, before
commercial.
we get to the book, I
What's that?
wanted, we didn't even want to get to the book just yet. I wanted to see your journey on the real estate end, but
Yeah,
that's okay because it's all very interesting.
yeah, yeah. So no, so eventually,
And
I meet.
I want to mention that I was very friendly with Harold Brown.
No, okay, wow. So if he's still alive, one day
No,
over drinks, you can tell him the story.
no, he's not alive, unfortunately.
God bless him. Yeah, yeah. So Harold, I can thank Harold Brown. I made a $90,000 commission back then, and that was a lot of money back then. That would be like $350,000 now.
Yeah.
So the shopping center was called the East India Mall, which is still in existence. In fact, like 5 years ago, one of my family members lived in Salem, Mass, and he got married, and so we had to drive out there. So I got to walk the shopping center, basically 30 plus years later. I was very proud, to say to my wife, this is, this is the shopping center I've always talked about. So it was nice. But then over the years, I had a stellar career where, we were the retail consultants to the 42nd Street Development Project, where in 92, the state calls us in, and the state owns half the block of 42nd Street between 7th and 8th. And the other half was the red light district with pimps, prostitutes, and drug dealers. And they said, Faith and Joe, at this point, Faith Hope Consolo is my business. Well, I'm her business partner, right? And we wound up being business partners for 26 years. The press would refer to us as the dynamic duo. And she said, look, is it possible we can do a family center on this half of the block while the other half is still the red light district? And we just looked at her and we, kind of chuckled. They said, well, we didn't think so. They said, well, why we have you here? We're interviewing, brokerage companies, and we need to do a business plan to send through the public process, was we need to raise $150 million to complete condemnation. Condemnation is a police action force where they actually they finish negotiating with the property owners, and then now they send them a letter and they say, "We're taking your property back. We're giving you X amount of dollars." And normally the landlords don't do very well, but in that scenario, as far as making a profit on their properties. They're just taking it back, and why they can do that for the betterment of the community. And for sure, it was the betterment of community. Because once we closed all those theaters, there was 9 theaters. It was the largest concentration of theaters of any place in the world on one block. 9 theaters. Once we closed the block down, crime went down 72% in the first year. Everybody, like, they did a V8 moment, like, why didn't we do this years ago? But it took 10 years to get to that point. So, and and then the state was very smart. They, uh, they didn't say, okay, we're going to be the developer. They divided up the block into 5 parcels, and they brought in property owners like Ratner, Forest City Ratner. They brought in Durst. They brought in Tishman and 2 other developers. And then those developers went out and they developed the property. On one project with Forest City Ratner, that he had the Empire Hotel in the middle of the block. But with his plan, the Empire Hotel would have suited better if it was at the end of his project. And one day, you know, his architect said it can be done, and it was done. They formed a train track rails that was about 200 feet long, and it took a whole day. They inched the theater. They raised it off its platform. There was no basement. It was built on slab, and they slowly moved the Empire Theater to the end of the project. And at that point, they built maybe a 40 story structure, which now houses the Hilton. If they had the theater where it was, they weren't able to build this superstructure. And eventually, Bruce Ratner brought us, Faith and I into a meeting, and he had no intentions of hiring a broker. And he said, "Oh, can you give us like your six best retailers?" So I recognized that Bruce was bringing in all the brokers and asking everybody for their six best retailers. So finally, I said, "Look, Bruce, this is after the presentation, and he was from Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, and so was Faith. So they had a bond there. So I said, Bruce, look, we can either go back to the office and we can call out six people, or we can deep dive into our client list and we can reach out to 5,000. I said, what would you like for us to reach for our six people or our 5,000? Now, this is what we call in sales the alternate choice close, where, they can choose from column A, from column B, but there's no column C. So he said, no, I want you to go back and reach out to your 5,000. So Faith and I we were very, we were a real act. So immediately she closes a book and she says, all right, Bruce. She said, let me go back. We'll put the contract together and we'll send it to you. And we'll get going. Okay, Bruce? And he said, yeah. Fine. Let's do that. Let's do that. And that's how we closed them. And we sent the agreement and a couple of hours later. And in a couple of days, we had it signed and we were the exclusive agents. And we did deals like we brought Applebee's restaurant. We brought an international newsstand. Back then, there was a sneaker company called Just for Feet. They took 25,000 square feet. And then from there, we got other projects in Times Square where we represented the Paramount Group at 1633 Broadway. This is the building, the office building where John Kennedy Jr. had his magazine company called George. And I used to see John rollerblading to work all the time, shirtless. The guy had a great physique, he was more handsome in person than in print or on TV.
So,
And there we did several big deals. We did Equinox. They took 35,000 square feet, the health club. We did this theme. This is when theme restaurants were going back then. You had Warner Brothers taking stores, Disney taking stores. So this gentleman from Ireland did a theme called Mars 2012. And so basically, we were renting out 35,000 square feet in the basement and the sub basement. And he made the elevator like a spaceship, where you went into the elevator and it had TV screens, and you felt you were launching off to Mars. And then when you went into the basement, it was designed like Mars, and that lasted about 15 years. So
so, so you're still hustling around in the commercial real
yeah.
estate space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now I have four American passports. Three are not so much expired, but they had no more pages stamped. And for years, I was going to the Financial Times Luxury Summit, the Herald Tribune Luxury Summit, and the New York Times Luxury Summit. And like 3 or 4 times a year, I'd be following these conferences, which Each of the conferences had 300 C-suite executives in them. And we could be going to places. I take my wife to like Marrakesh, Singapore, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Vienna, and it was quasi business. And then we stay a couple of extra days, to look at the different markets to see if I can pick up any business from the retailers or the restaurants. Yeah, so I had a pretty colorful career and still do, and I'm still very passionate. In fact, I'll be at a restaurant, I'll be talking to the manager, and my wife's kicking me under the table. Like, do you have to, do you have to try to get, this restaurant to take other locations? And as she's kicking me, I keep moving down the table, and she keeps moving, and she's hitting me with her knee. And then finally, I get their information. I find out the contact to call at corporate, and when they walk away, I look at it, I go, "Are you crazy?" I said, this is my job. She wanted some quiet, some solace, but you can never get quiet and solace with somebody like me. I mean, looking at the
And I
manager, that
don't
was,
I don't think that is I think that's true. I don't
yeah,
think they can get quiet.
right,
You have a
right.
lot to talk about.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, this happened with PJ Clark in by Battery Park. It's like, are you crazy? But one of these this deal, it's going to be a six-figure commission. So yeah, so
Have you ever heard of Have you ever heard of Broad Nosh
yeah, I think
Deli?
I have. Yeah,
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 in New York.
yeah.
Yeah,
So I have books with cards, just cards of all the people that I pitched. Like nowadays you get people and they want to do it electronically.
right,
I try to tell them, I go, look, once it goes in the phone, I'm not going to remember 3 or 4 days from now. You got to hand out cards. There's nothing wrong with cards. Oh, I want to save a tree. But sure enough, when I come back to the office, I print their sheet this way, 3 weeks from now, 4 weeks ago now, when I'm hungry and I want to do a deal, at least I have something to touch, and I have a phone number or an
right.
email to call.
So let's move on to the book before because we're going to be running out of time,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
we want to talk about the book, Memoirs of a Watch Salesman.
Right, right,
Which,
right.
oh, there you go, right
Yeah,
there.
yeah. So here you go.
A New
Can you
York real
get it?
estate story. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, so basically, the reason why I call it Memoirs of a Watch Salesman is I never forget my humble beginnings. So when I'm going to go into a meeting, whether it's Larry Silverstein who rebuilt the World Trade Center, or Abby Rosen who owns the Seagram's building, I'm always that young kid, with a box of watches, ready to get the next order, you know. So my wife hates it that I talk about the watches. She says, "Don't tell people you sold watches." But that's my root, and I'm not embarrassed to who I am. So I originally it was just memoirs of a watch salesman, but then recently I told my ad agency, "Look," I said, "I want you to put it's a New York real estate story. This way, when it's on a book stand, people could." I always still pick it up and they'll say, What is this? These are two different things." And maybe they'll read the preface.
Well, Joe,
So,
I like the story. Now I'm going to tell you why I like the story.
yeah, tell me.
Because, young people don't really get that.
Right.
And I think it's very important that they take a look at that book because
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
what happens is they go to college, they come out of
Right,
college, they think, oh, well, now I get my $200,000 job because I went to
right,
college and I don't have to do anything.
right.
But you know what? You go on, sell watches on the street corners or
Yeah, yeah,
silverware or dishes, and you know what? That's going to make you one of the top people in your career
yeah, 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 yeah.
because it's the experience that you get from that.
Right, 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 right. So then I became a bit of a marketer. So here, Fate's name was
Consult.
was Faith Hope
Yeah.
Consolo. So then we designed a branding where we used to say to find the best retail space, you need faith, right? So
Right.
we were one of the first ones to do to brand. At the very beginning, yeah, and this is a beautiful picture of us. This was the dynamic duo. Do you see the full picture?
Yeah, I see it.
Yeah, it's a beautiful picture. Listen, we were together for 26 years. At the height of our career, these are all the properties that we handled exclusively. So we used to get all the landlords to pitch in, on the advertising. But when you have this many properties, you can ask somebody for $500 a month, which is pittance to them. But
Right.
now they're part of this big branding. So, and then here we go. This is my 40th anniversary. I made some noise, and these are all the people that wish me good luck. So yeah, so it's 40 years. I still, I'll be like Larry Silverstein. Larry at 93, he's still making deals. And I'm playing tennis 3, 4 times a week. Thank God I'm very healthy. I'm going to be turning 70 in October. And I still got the moxie. I still want to do big deals.
Yeah.
So so
There's,
the website, it's here.
but
I
before we
even
get
have
to the website, before you mention the
okay.
website,
Yeah, yeah.
because this book is, like I said, this is an important book for young people to read,
Oh
so
yeah.
so they can understand the journey you have to go through.
Right, right.
You don't just get up out of college and wake up to a big career. You
No,
have to go and earn it. And
that's right.
that's what a lot of young people are forgetting nowadays.
Right, right.
But
Yeah, right. They say, I reached out to 20 people on LinkedIn and I'm exhausted.
yeah,
Basically, we would go out and do face-to-face meetings and impress the flesh and get to know people. And then, you get to understand the dynamics, or how to close somebody,
right,
how to get someone to say yes at that meeting, or make an impression and close the deal in a day or two.
but that
One
brought you,
time,
but that
yeah,
brought you into something that you turned out to love,
yes,
which
yes,
is
yes, yes,
commercial real estate,
yes, yes,
brokerage.
yes, yes.
And you know what? You, I bet you're never going to retire.
No, I'm never going to retire. I'm going to be doing deals. No, I'm never going to retire. First of all, if I retire, I'm going to be staying home, and my wife will give me a honeydew list every day, and I will be just totally her servant.
But
So
you're not much different from anyone else that gets in this industry and they love I guess you call it the race or the
yeah, it's
competition or
It's no,
just,
it's no the I can do without the competition. You
yeah,
know, brokers are a funny bunch. They want you to do well just as long as you don't do better than them.
right,
So, I can do without the competition. But it's just, you know, when you're talking to a customer, it's listening. It's finding out, like, when you do work with a retailer, you want to put him in a store where his customers are. So you got to spend a lot of time with just the question is, who is your customer? And he may describe, a working class person, or, a secretary, or my customers are architects, or the advertising, or, my customer is, I want to be just, affluent people on Madison Avenue on the Upper East Side. Whatever it is, you got to ask them the question, who is your customer? And then you have to shut up and you have to listen and you have to take notes.
so it's
So,
not just about making that shot commission. This is
no.
creating a long-term relationship.
Right, right, exactly, exactly. And it's wonderful. I just got a call the other day. I did a jewelry store on Madison Avenue, and now he's like, look, I got a new relationship with a bank. I got 5 markets, but we can't do 5 markets at one time. But I want to do LA, I want to do Connecticut, I want to do West Palm Beach. I want to do Miami. And, And nowadays, years back, you had to be with a big firm. And the big firm, like at Garrett, we had to put 5 listings in a month. If you didn't do 5 listings a month, they would take 1% off of your total commission. So if it was $90,000, they would take $900 off. But it was just the fact that they were taking this money.
Right.
But nowadays you got CoStar. I mean, look, I can promote CoStar. I can be their advocate. With CoStar now, they give you the entire United States and the United Kingdom. So as long as you have a warm body, you can service this customer in the other cities, the other
Right.
states. So, but then again, years ago, 14 years ago, I realized Faith was getting older. I mean, I never could imagine she retire. I mean, I never ever thought that she was going to pass away, which she did 6 or 7 years ago. So I put together the Secret Broker Society. So what is the Secret Broker Society? So it's a group that I put together of 30 brokers nationally and internationally. And every 6 weeks, we get on a phone and we all compare notes of our market. The deal is you don't have to do deals with other brokers, but if you're going to be part of the group, you have to talk about your market. So, 30 people never get on, but at least 9 people get on. But in the 9 people, you can hear about 9 different markets around the world, and you get a snapshot. So after like 60 or 90 minutes, you get off the phone, you're like, oh, this is happening in London. This is happening in LA. This is happening in San Francisco. And it gives you a world perspective. You may be talking to a client at ICSC. He may want to start a conversation in London. Now you have tidbits that you can throw into the conversation. So now we celebrated our 14th anniversary. People say, "Do you have a secret handshake?" No, but we have a symbol. We have a symbol, and let me see if I can find it. It's this little secret broker with very shifty eyes. That's our symbol, but it's cute and everybody likes it, and everybody they're appreciative, and so that was another thing that you got to constantly. Here's the symbol. I don't know if you can see it. That's our
Oh, like
symbol.
a
Yeah,
like
he's a cute little guy with a
a
hat.
mystery man.
Yeah, 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 yeah. He's the Secret Broker Society. That's our symbol. So then I had to shorten it, the SBS group, before we started getting like the FBI checking us. What type of organization is this?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
right.
so Joe, tell me, how would if someone wants to get a hold of your book,
Yeah,
where
yeah,
can
yeah.
they get that?
Right. So here's the business card. I mean, so the website is, and you got to be careful you don't spell it incorrectly. It's memoirs of a watch salesman.com. So it's no spaces. Memoirs of a watch salesman.com. It's just one big website and it's 2 pages. And so can you see the cards pretty clearly?
No, I can't see it.
Okay. How about now?
No, now I can't see it at all.
No? Okay.
There you go.
Okay. So memoirs of a watch salesman.com.
Okay,
Yeah, yeah. So it's
that's
simple.
easy
And
enough.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And they can purchase it on that site.
Yeah, yeah, we're pre-selling right now. Yes, yeah. So there's a buy, and I'll give everybody the corporate discount. So if you put in the coupon 007 on the special coupon spot, you'll get a nice discount.
Okay, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So
And
Joe,
so the book has lessons after every chapter. Every chapter is a slice of my life, of me getting in trouble, getting out of trouble, selling something big, moving on. And at the end, I give a lesson learned. So the book is and the book is a lot of it's sales, it's competition. There's a bit of betrayal in there. Okay. There's no sex. So don't, if you're looking for the book for sex, you're not getting any sex. But there's
So it's not a
betrayal.
romantic book.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, there's a lot of romance there. My partner and I, 26 years, you always say, like, what's going on there, you know? But we were 26 years, and I miss her dearly, and she was amazing. So she used to have these post-its. It would say faith on it, and she would hand them out, and give instructions to people. So she had a newsletter that everybody, it was a New York newsletter, but everybody used to steal. They used to put their name on it. So one day, her 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 pad said faith on it, right? So what I did, I put that's how we started. You need faith report. So it was the faith report that came out of this red pad, the faith report. So we looked at each other. We realized that it was not going to be the New York newsletter anymore. It was going to be the faith report. And then at that point, people couldn't plagiarize it. They couldn't steal it because everybody knew it was Faith's report, you know?
Well, Joe, we could probably talk all day long.
Yes, 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 yes.
But unfortunately, we're running out of time. We're running
Okay,
out of
fine.
time right now, and we're talking with Joseph Aquino, and he is the president of JAACRES, and he wrote this book, Memoirs of a Watch Salesman, and you can get it at memoirs of a watchsalesman.com.
Right. So
Again, I
actually,
want
the full name is Memoirs of a Watch Salesman, a New York real estate story. But the website is memoirsofawatchsalesman.com. You're right.
that's great. Thank you, Joe. It's been a pleasure talking with you,
Okay.
and
Thank you very much. And thank your audience. And thanks for listening.
well, it was our pleasure. And you've been
Okay.
listening to the NYREJ podcast, and I'm your host, Rick Kaplan. Until next time.